July 22, 1934. Chicago is heavy with summer heat. Streetcars grind along Lincoln Avenue. The air carries the scent of tobacco, gasoline, and late-night anticipation. Neon lights flicker against brick facades as the Biograph Theater glows in red and gold beneath a humid sky. Inside, a crime film entertains a full house. Outside, history is waiting. Unmarked cars sit quietly along the curb. Men in dark suits stand separated from the crowd. One checks his pocket watch. Another pretends to scan a newspaper. Their posture is casual. Their eyes are not. They have been waiting for weeks. John Dillinger is inside. For more than a year, Dillinger had humiliated American law enforcement. He robbed banks in Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois. He studied response times. He analyzed patrol routes. He understood that American law enforcement was divided by geography. County sheriffs could not pursue beyond county lines. State police could not freely operate across neighboring states. Criminals, however, adapted to mobility. Dillinger famously escaped from jail in Crown Point, reportedly using a wooden gun carved and darkened to resemble a real weapon. Whether legend refined the details or not, the escape exposed a structural weakness. Newspapers transformed him into a sensation. In the depths of the Great Depression, when banks foreclosed on farms and savings evaporated, some Americans viewed Dillinger not merely as a criminal, but as a defiant symbol against financial institutions they blamed for their suffering. But to Washington, Dillinger represented something else. He represented fragmentation. He revealed that federal authority lacked coordination across state lines, and fragmentation invites challenge. When the theater doors open and Dillinger steps into the humid Chicago night, an informant signals subtly. Agents move. A command pierces the air. Gunfire echoes between storefronts. Within seconds, the most wanted man in America lies on the pavement. By morning, headlines spread nationwide. But this was not simply the fall of an outlaw. It was a demonstration. The federal government could now pursue across borders. It could coordinate intelligence. It could centralize power. Yet just 26 years earlier, no such national force existed. To understand how the United States built a federal investigative machine capable of hunting across state lines, we must go back to the beginning. Back to 1908. Back to a quiet memorandum that few Americans noticed at the time. The United States at the turn of the 20th century was transforming rapidly. Railroads connected distant cities. Telegraph lines transmitted information instantly. Corporations expanded across multiple states. Financial networks grew more complex. The country had modernized. Its enforcement structure had not. Federal laws governed interstate commerce, land fraud, and antitrust violations. But there was no permanent investigative body capable of enforcing those laws nationwide. Attorney General Charles Bonaparte saw the vulnerability. In 1908, frustrated by reliance on the Secret Service for investigations outside its primary mandate, he authorized the creation of a small corps of special agents within the Department of Justice. There was no ceremony, no national announcement, just a memorandum. 34 agents formed what was called the Bureau of Investigation. Their assignments were administrative and procedural: land fraud, interstate commerce violations, antitrust enforcement. Few Americans noticed. There was no mythology attached to it, no cinematic legend, no anticipation that this modest bureau would one day influence domestic intelligence, counter-terrorism policy, and global investigations. What transformed that small administrative unit into a central pillar of American governance was not ambition alone. It was crisis. Crisis would expand its mandate. Crisis would legitimize its growth. And one man would shape its structure more than any other. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. When J. Edgar Hoover joined the Bureau of Investigation in 1919, the United States was emerging from war into instability. World War I had ended, but peace did not bring calm. Labor strikes spread across industrial cities. Anarchist bombings shook public confidence. Fear of radical ideology intensified during what became known as the First Red Scare. The federal government was uncertain. Hoover was not. Assigned to the Justice Department's Radical Division, he began compiling detailed records on suspected extremists during the Palmer raids. The operations themselves would later face criticism for overreach, but they revealed something essential about Hoover. He believed information reduced chaos. He catalogued names. He built files. He cross-referenced affiliations. In Hoover's worldview, uncertainty was dangerous. Records were control. In 1924, following corruption scandals that had damaged the Bureau's credibility, President Calvin Coolidge appointed Hoover as director. He was 29 years old. The Bureau he inherited was fragile and politically compromised. Hoover moved quickly and decisively. He dismissed agents he considered politically appointed rather than professionally qualified. He instituted educational requirements. He centralized authority in Washington. He standardized reporting systems. He wanted uniformity. He wanted discipline. He wanted insulation from partisan interference. Under his leadership, the Bureau established a centralized fingerprint repository. Millions of fingerprint cards were meticulously catalogued. Local police departments across the country began submitting records to Washington. For the first time, a suspect apprehended in one state could be connected to crimes committed in another. In 1932, Hoover created the Bureau's Technical Laboratory, one of the first forensic labs of its kind. Ballistics analysis, handwriting comparison, chemical testing, and fiber examination became tools of federal prosecution. Science strengthened legitimacy. Professionalism reinforced authority. But Hoover understood something beyond investigative technique. Institutions endure through structure and through perception. He cultivated a public image of incorruptibility. Agents were expected to maintain strict standards of conduct. Public scandal was intolerable. Discipline was mandatory. Behind the scenes, another system expanded quietly. Files, thousands of them. The Bureau began compiling records not only on criminals, but on political activists, suspected radicals, and individuals perceived as potential threats to national stability. Hoover viewed this not as intrusion, but as preparation. In a rapidly changing nation, instability could emerge quickly, and instability in Hoover's mind had to be anticipated. Presidents valued his briefings. Members of Congress respected his reports. Journalists cultivated access. Administrations changed. Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, yet J. Edgar Hoover remained. Longevity brought influence. Influence brought autonomy. By the early 1930s, Hoover had transformed a small investigative bureau into a disciplined federal machine. But discipline alone does not create power. Power requires legitimacy. And legitimacy often emerges during crisis. The Great Depression would provide that crisis. As the economy collapsed and public trust fractured, crime adapted with speed and precision. Criminal networks learned to move faster than local law enforcement could coordinate. And suddenly the federal government faced a choice: remain fragmented or expand. The decision would redefine the Bureau forever. By the early 1930s, the United States was not simply in recession, it was in collapse. Between 1929 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks failed. Unemployment soared above 20%. Families lost farms that had been in their possession for generations. Breadlines formed in cities once defined by industrial optimism. Economic despair reshapes public perception. It also reshapes crime. The criminal networks that had matured during Prohibition did not disappear when alcohol became legal again in 1933. They pivoted, they diversified, they adapted. Automobiles made interstate travel efficient. Telegraph and telephone lines facilitated coordination. Criminal groups moved across state boundaries before local law enforcement could organize pursuit. The law was local. Crime was mobile. John Dillinger became the most visible embodiment of this imbalance. He did not rob banks impulsively. He studied them. He selected institutions he believed carried insured funds. He avoided unnecessary violence when possible. He understood optics. He understood narrative. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow operated across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana. They relied on speed and unpredictability. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd cultivated sympathy in rural communities where distrust of financial institutions ran deep. George Machine Gun Kelly orchestrated one of the era's most notorious kidnappings, the abduction of oil magnate Charles Urschel in 1933. The Urschel case marked a decisive shift. Because the ransom negotiations crossed state lines, federal jurisdiction applied. For the first time, the Bureau pursued a high-profile criminal case with fully coordinated interstate authority. Agents traced ransom bills, mapped communication patterns, and collaborated across jurisdictions. Kelly was arrested in Memphis after federal agents surrounded his hideout. The symbolic message was unmistakable. Interstate crime now carried federal consequence. In 1934, Congress reinforced that message legislatively. Interstate flight to avoid prosecution became a federal offense. Bank robbery and kidnapping that crossed state lines fell squarely under federal authority. Agents were authorized to carry firearms. Training intensified at Quantico. Operational discipline hardened. The Bureau's posture shifted from investigative assistance to national enforcement. When Dillinger was tracked to Chicago in July 1934, the operation reflected this transformation. Weeks of surveillance, informant coordination, interstate communication. The ambush outside the Biograph Theater did more than eliminate a criminal. It demonstrated that the federal government had closed a structural gap. Hollywood took notice. Films depicted disciplined G-men confronting reckless outlaws. Newsreels celebrated federal raids. Radio broadcasts dramatized pursuits. The image of the incorruptible federal agent began to eclipse the romanticized outlaw. Public perception shifted. The FBI became synonymous with order in a period of economic chaos. With public approval came funding. With funding came expansion. Field offices multiplied across the country. Recruitment standards increased. The Bureau's national footprint solidified. But legitimacy gained through confrontation also brought expectation. The public now viewed the FBI as guardian of internal stability, and stability would soon face a new kind of threat. Not armed robbers, not rural bandits, but ideology. The battlefield was about to become invisible. When World War II engulfed Europe, the FBI's mission expanded beyond traditional criminal enforcement. The threat was no longer bank robbery, it was infiltration. In 1942, 8 German saboteurs landed on American shores by submarine in what became known as Operation Pastorius. Their objective was to destroy industrial facilities and undermine wartime production. Within weeks, the FBI captured them. The arrests reinforced public confidence. The Bureau had demonstrated competence in counterintelligence. During wartime, vigilance is rarely controversial. Surveillance becomes synonymous with patriotism. But when the war ended in 1945, tension did not dissolve. It transformed. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union gave way to rivalry. The Cold War introduced a new form of confrontation, ideological, covert, and persistent. Espionage cases intensified anxiety. In 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested and later convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Their execution in 1953 sent a chilling message about internal betrayal. Communism was no longer viewed as distant ideology. It was perceived as a domestic vulnerability. Congressional hearings amplified suspicion. Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigations dominated headlines, accusing individuals within government and entertainment of communist ties. While the FBI maintained its own intelligence operations, its activities operated alongside this broader climate of suspicion, sometimes aligned in concern, sometimes independently. Under Hoover's leadership, domestic intelligence programs expanded significantly. Informants were placed within political organizations. Wiretaps were authorized under national security rationale. Labor unions, academic institutions, civil rights groups, and anti-war organizations came under monitoring. The expansion did not occur in a single dramatic decree. It was incremental, file by file, authorization by authorization. COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, aimed to monitor and disrupt groups considered subversive. Its tactics included infiltration, psychological operations, and attempts to create internal divisions. Supporters argued that such measures were necessary during a period of nuclear tension and ideological confrontation. Critics argued that constitutional protections were at risk. The line between prevention and intrusion blurred. Hoover believed instability could be exploited by foreign adversaries. In his view, early intervention reduced risk. But in a democratic system, dissent is not synonymous with disloyalty. The civil rights movement reshaped the moral landscape of the nation. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. organized protests and challenged entrenched segregation. Amid concerns about alleged communist influence within King's circle, the FBI authorized wiretaps. Recordings were collected. An anonymous letter later urged him to reconsider his public role. The episode remains one of the most debated chapters in the Bureau's history. To some, it reflected Cold War vigilance. To others, it represented intrusion into lawful activism. Throughout the 1960s, American society grew more polarized. The Vietnam War intensified protest. Urban unrest erupted in several cities. Universities became centers of political mobilization. The FBI expanded monitoring of groups it believed could escalate into violence. Yet public trust in government institutions began to erode. Televised images of war, protest, and political upheaval reshaped perception. Investigative journalism became increasingly assertive. The Bureau that had once symbolized incorruptible order during the gangster era now faced scrutiny of a different kind. Power accumulated during crisis was being examined during unrest, and scrutiny was about to become institutional. On May 2, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover died in his sleep. For nearly 48 years, he had directed the Bureau of Investigation, later renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in 1935. 8 presidents had served during his tenure. Through war, depression, ideological conflict, and social upheaval, Hoover had remained a constant presence. His longevity had provided stability. It had also concentrated authority. Just weeks after his death, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first, the break-in appeared minor, a case of political espionage. But as investigations unfolded, connections to the Nixon administration emerged. Attempts to obstruct justice intensified the crisis. Public trust in executive authority declined sharply. If political power could be abused, what about intelligence power? In 1975, amid growing skepticism, the United States Senate established the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, widely known as the Church Committee. Its mandate was unprecedented. For the first time in American history, intelligence operations conducted by federal agencies, including the FBI, would be examined in public. Televised hearings revealed practices that had previously been classified. Documents were displayed before cameras. Former officials testified under oath. The American public learned about domestic surveillance programs that had operated for decades. They learned about COINTELPRO's infiltration tactics. They learned about monitoring of civil rights leaders and political organizations. The revelations were unsettling for many citizens. Supporters of the Bureau argued that these operations had occurred within the historical context of intense geopolitical tension. Critics argued that constitutional boundaries had not always been respected. The outcome was reform, not dismantlement. In 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, establishing a special court to oversee certain surveillance activities involving foreign intelligence. Attorney General guidelines clarified restrictions on domestic investigations. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. The FBI retained its authority, but that authority now operated within more explicitly defined legal boundaries. The culture inside the Bureau adjusted. Procedures were codified. Approvals became more layered. The unchecked expansion of previous decades slowed. For a time, the balance between security and liberty appeared recalibrated. But history has a pattern. Moments of reform often follow exposure. Moments of expansion often follow crisis. And another crisis was approaching, one that would redefine national security for an entire generation. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the United States faced an attack unlike any in its modern history. 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked. 2 struck the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 hit the Pentagon. 1 crashed in a Pennsylvania field after passengers attempted to retake control. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. The scale of destruction shocked the nation, but as the immediate crisis gave way to investigation, deeper questions emerged. How had this happened? In the months and years that followed, inquiries revealed fragments of intelligence that had existed before the attacks. Reports about suspected extremist activity, warnings regarding unusual flight school enrollments, information scattered across agencies, not fully integrated. The reforms of the 1970s had introduced clearer legal boundaries around domestic intelligence and information sharing. In the decades that followed, debates emerged regarding how those safeguards intersected with interagency coordination. The September 11th attacks reshaped that debate. Congress responded swiftly. The USA Patriot Act expanded surveillance authorities and enhanced intelligence sharing capabilities between agencies. Barriers that had separated criminal investigation from intelligence analysis were reduced. The FBI underwent a structural transformation. Counterterrorism became its central mission. Field offices reorganized around intelligence collection and prevention. Analysts became as central as field agents. Information sharing accelerated. The Bureau invested heavily in digital infrastructure. Electronic communications, financial networks, and international data flows became central investigative terrain. The Internet, once peripheral, became operational ground. The mission shifted from prosecution after crime to prevention before attack. Moments of shock were followed by expanded authority. Over time, those expanded tools became embedded within institutional practice. Supporters argued that evolving threats required adaptive capability. Civil liberties advocates cautioned that surveillance in the digital age required vigilance and oversight. The tension was not new. It echoed earlier eras: wartime counterintelligence, Cold War surveillance, gangster-era jurisdictional reform. Each crisis had expanded federal capacity. Each expansion had prompted later reflection. In the years following 9/11, the FBI confronted a shifting threat landscape. International terrorism remained a priority, but domestic extremism re-emerged as a significant concern. Cybercrime grew exponentially, targeting infrastructure, corporations, and government systems. Foreign interference in democratic processes became a national focus. Encryption complicated investigative access. Technology evolved faster than legislation. The Bureau adapted continually. New divisions were created. Analytical capabilities expanded. Global partnerships deepened. The FBI of the 21st century was no longer defined solely by bank robbers or Cold War spies. It operated in cyberspace. It tracked digital financial flows. It investigated ransomware attacks and election security threats. Its mandate had become both broader and more complex than at any time in its history. Public perception, however, became increasingly polarized. High-profile investigations into political figures drew intense media attention. Some Americans viewed the Bureau as a guardian of constitutional order. Others perceived it as a symbol of concentrated federal authority. In an age of rapid information exchange and partisan division, narratives formed quickly, yet beneath contemporary debate lies a historical pattern. Crisis, expansion, scrutiny, adjustment. The Bureau had evolved through each phase, and it would continue to do so. As the 21st century advanced, the FBI found itself operating in a landscape more complex than any previous era. Threats were no longer confined to physical geography. Cyber intrusions could originate across oceans in seconds. Digital propaganda could influence millions without crossing a single border. Financial transactions moved invisibly through encrypted networks. The Bureau adapted accordingly. Cyber divisions expanded. Counterintelligence operations intensified. Joint terrorism task forces multiplied across major cities. Data analysis became as central to investigations as field surveillance once had been. But with expanded technical capability came renewed debate. How much surveillance is necessary to prevent harm? How much oversight is sufficient to prevent abuse? Public trust, once bolstered during the gangster era and wartime victories, became more fragile in a polarized political climate. Investigations involving public officials intensified scrutiny. Each inquiry carried legal weight and political consequence. In a hyper-connected era, perception often traveled faster than fact. Some citizens viewed the Bureau as a stabilizing institution within a turbulent democracy. Others questioned its scope and discretion. Yet the FBI itself operates within a layered system of checks and balances. Judicial oversight, congressional review, internal compliance divisions, Inspector General investigations. Policies evolve. Leadership changes. Directors now serve 10-year terms. A structural reform designed to balance independence with accountability. The institution that once operated with near absolute continuity under Hoover now functions within a more distributed oversight framework. Still, tension persists. Because the FBI occupies a unique space, it is neither purely intelligence agency nor purely law enforcement. It straddles both worlds. It investigates crimes. It prevents threats. It advises policymakers. It gathers information. It must act swiftly. It must act carefully. The balance is never simple, and the public conversation surrounding that balance remains active. Throughout its history, the FBI has been both praised and criticized, celebrated and scrutinized, expanded and constrained. Each era has left an imprint on its structure. Each crisis has altered its trajectory. Each reform has reshaped its boundaries. The question is not whether the Bureau will continue to evolve. It will. The question is how a democratic society negotiates the scope of power granted to those tasked with protecting it. Because power, once established, rarely remains static. It grows in response to fear. It is examined in response to exposure. It is adjusted in response to public demand. The FBI stands as a case study in that cycle. More than a century has passed since a quiet memorandum created a small investigative unit inside the Department of Justice. 34 agents. No ceremony, no mythology. Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation operates across the United States and internationally, coordinating with foreign partners and domestic agencies alike. It has dismantled organized crime syndicates, exposed espionage networks, prevented terrorist attacks, investigated corruption at the highest levels of government, disrupted cyber operations. It has also faced criticism over surveillance practices and institutional reach. Its authority expanded during the Great Depression, expanded again during World War II, expanded during the Cold War, contracted under post-Watergate reform, expanded after September 11th, adjusted again under renewed oversight. The Bureau reflects the nation it serves, complex, dynamic, at times divided, yet enduring. A constitutional republic requires security to survive. It also requires restraint to remain free. Power granted during moments of fear must eventually withstand examination during moments of calm. Authority justified by necessity must endure the scrutiny of principle. There is no permanent equilibrium between liberty and security, only recalibration, only negotiation, only the continuous work of democratic oversight. From Dillinger's fall on a Chicago sidewalk to digital investigations in encrypted networks, the story of the FBI mirrors the broader American experiment. A nation confronting threat, granting power, questioning that power, refining its boundaries, then repeating the cycle. The balance between protection and freedom is never finished. It is defined, redefined, and guarded, again and again.
Subscribe to the American Vault. Turn on the notifications, because in a world of shadows, the only thing more dangerous than the truth is not knowing it at all. See you in the next file.